groups that are sponsoring tonight's presentation by Ken Toole, they include the Missoula Advocates for Social Justice, the Environmental Law Group at the University of Montana School of Law, the Jeanette Rankin Peace Resource Center, the Peace and Justice Board of the University Congregational Church, Missoula Women for Peace, which is a chapter of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. When the advocates decided to invite Ken to come speak, it was back in January, and of course the events the last 2 or 3 weeks have made the topic, particularly with the militia and the Federalists or Constitutionalists, much more apropos. But Ken wanted to speak about the connections involving these groups, the anti-environmentalists, the anti-federal, or the Federalists, so-called, with always the quotations, I think, and the militia movement. And he'll be doing that, though I suspect that he may have perhaps more to say about the militia movement in view of what's been going on. Ken didn't want me to give a flowery introduction, so I'm not. He wouldn't tell me anything about his background.
Well,
I know it's distinguished, though. I know he's won awards and he's just too modest, but at a meeting recently of the Montana Human Rights Network board, people from around the state on the board met in Billings, and one of the speakers that addressed us was Dan Levitas, the past executive director of the Center for Democratic Renewal in Atlanta. And Levitas, who you may have seen on CNN and other programs, network programs just in the last week, commenting, said that the Montana Human Rights Network is the only organization of its kind in the country, bringing together groups and task forces from around the state to do what it does in regard to anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia and hate crimes. And Ken, of course, has been at the forefront of that for a number of years, and he's right there on the cutting edge all the time. And I just think we in Missoula, he's a former resident of Missoula, the state of Montana is just enormously lucky to have him. So with that, I'll give you Ken.
Thanks. Can people hear okay? Should do a sound check. I got the flowery introduction anyway. I want to, Ralph has explained a little bit about the network. I want to let you know that the Human Rights Network is private, nonprofit. We're supported by contributions. You will have several opportunities as the evening progresses, things moving through the audience and things like that to contribute further. But we'll save that for the commercial break. And tonight, what we want to talk about, or hopefully try and have some discussion about, is the kind of social milieu that's out there that has enabled what are really very radical right-wing groups to kind of mainstream their message. And we'll focus on the militia movement because I don't think I would have any choice but to focus on the militia movement right now, even if I didn't want to. But it's also, in recent months, actually about the last year and a half, militias around the country have been doing a bang-up business recruiting people on some themes that obviously are appealing to a broader audience than in the past maybe 4 or 5 years. First, I want to talk about extremism generally. The network, when we formed in 1990, what had happened around Montana is there were a number of local groups who had formed in response to white supremacist activity. One up in Knoxon, one in Ronan, one in Helena, a group in Great Falls, and they had formed very specifically to address white supremacist groups in their communities. Western Montana, what we were seeing was Aryan Nation kinds of organization, guys who like to wear camo, sneak out in the middle of the night and put on little white hoods and burn things. Pretty obvious racist connections. In eastern Montana, and the period I'm talking about now is mid 80s to up to 1990. In eastern Montana, there were a number of organizations going around during the farm crisis approaching farmers and saying, you know, of course you're losing your farm, and we can tell you why. The real reason is not international trade policy. The real reason is, in fact, international Jewish banking conspiracies. Very anti-Semitic groups, but they looked really different. They were populist. I mean, they looked like populist organizations, and we began to refer to them as regressive populists. So those were the kinds of phenomena that we were seeing through the late 80s and when we formed. And so these groups got together and said, what we need to do is form an organization that has a statewide focus to monitor and report on what's going on out there, to try to enlighten the public about these various movements that we see in the activities of these groups, also to work on public policy issues, to promote tolerance, promote pluralism, diversity, all those kind of warm, fuzzy words that human rights groups tend to put in their mission statements. And so we did that and kind of blithely went down the path saying, well, we're fighting white supremacists, and this is very simple because we know exactly what white supremacists are. They're racist, they believe these things, and had a fairly clear idea of what we were dealing with. Very quickly, the legislature started to convene, our board met. We had gotten some reports about gay bashing from around the state, and we naively said, well, what we need to do, we don't want to see anybody victimized in society by these organizations, and we were certainly seeing white supremacist organizations engaging in gay bashing, and so we said, what we want to do is repeal the state sodomy statute, which makes it a felony for same-sex contact between consenting adults, do some hate crime reporting legislation, include sexual orientation in the State Human Rights Act. So we had this kind of harmless gay agenda that we went off to the legislature with. We came up very quickly against a different social phenomena, which I think modern commentators refer to as the religious right. Pat Robertson's organization is a good example, I think probably one of the most well-known in the country. And so the board said, well, okay, this means we're really having to change a little bit of what we do. It's not exactly white supremacy, but it still fits in this mission statement. This is why we all write these mission statements. You can do what you need to do. And so we kind of took on this new area of emphasis, the religious right. Now we're talking about 2 or 3 years ago. In the last year and a half or so, we've started to get calls surrounding local land use planning issues and the behavior of certain individuals involved in these local land use planning fights. And I think probably all of us have read about planners getting midnight phone calls, county commissioners being told not to sit in the window, local governments considering putting in bulletproof glass. And our board looked at that and said, this is something that is troubling to us, that the discourse and the discussion in our communities is really kind of seizing up because of all of this controversy, and we have kind of defined now what, this is a justification for why I'm going to talk about the things I'm going to talk about tonight. We're very concerned about the whole mix of things that's going on in communities in Montana in particular, but it's going on nationwide, that is creating this atmosphere of polarization that really in many instances is freezing up democratic processes. And so in the last year or so, we've been looking at things from that context. What's going on, what's happening out there that is stifling democratic processes, and what we've really tried to focus on is extremism. Because what we've seen is whether you're talking about hate groups, whether you're talking about wise use groups, whether you're talking about the religious right, there are some common themes, there are some common tactics, there are ways these groups work similarly in a manner that really divides up and polarizes communities and creates an environment where hardcore hate activists can then come in and build their core constituency. And so in the next 20 minutes, I'll explain all that, and then we can go home knowing that we understand it completely and don't need to worry about it too much anymore. We can laugh on this serious topic, too. We have to, I think. First, talking about the extremist construct. No matter which of these kinds of groups we're talking about several things happen in the same way with all of these kinds of organizations. And the first is creating an us versus them dynamic, that they have to, us versus them, they have to build their support base by driving people apart and creating, and any organization has to do this, and creating a sense of belonging to their membership and a sense of something out there that they don't like that they need to address. In the case of extremist groups, that's generally fairly personified. In other words, they get very personal. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that the system has failed. The system of laws, rules, and regulations that we all kind of live under has failed. And it's not delivering to us those things that we are rightfully entitled to, that we really deserve. And again, that's pretty common. Labor organizing, environmental groups. This is just kind of good community organizing work. You go in and you create a sense of belonging. You've got to explain to people what the problem is and get them to join your group and support your group. The next step, though, is where there starts to be kind of a diversion, and that is that the system is not working. That fact is not an accident. That's happening deliberately because they, whoever the they may be, has taken the system away from us and is now actively using it against us, to challenge us, to attack us, to make us into victims, and to oppress us, fill in the blanks. The mechanism for doing this very often is conspiracy theories, that there's this international cabal out there that is actively using the system against you to take things away, to keep you from having what you really deserve. You, Mr. Farmer, can't make a living on the farm anymore because of the international Jews. You, Mr. Blue-collar worker, can't get a job in your trade anymore because of these affirmative action programs and the blacks. The us versus them, building upon conspiracies. The thing to understand about conspiracy theories is how isolating they are. Once people start to buy into these rather elaborate conspiracy theories, it's very hard to reach in with information that counters what's coming out of the conspiracy mill. Because as soon as you present a fact that doesn't fit the conspiracy, what happens? It becomes a part of the conspiracy. Of course they say that. Of course those human rights people say that. They're a bunch of Jewish homosexuals. What else are they going to say? And that's used then to keep people in. And you know, how conscious that effort is, I think we can all speculate about. But in fact, that's what happens. And once people start to buy the idea that black helicopters are coming over the hill, and anybody who tells you they aren't is either an idiot or is part of the conspiracy, it's very hard to reach in and intercede in that and say, well, they aren't really black, they're just dark green. Of course you say that. So they're very isolating. Then the final piece of this, and this is particularly true of the hate movement, is access to a higher truth. Within white supremacist groups, there is a theology called identity, or Christian identity, which holds that God's chosen people are Northern Europeans, and that Jewish people are descendants of a mating between Eve and the snake. They are evil incarnate, Satan's spawn walking the earth. And everybody else is what they call pre-Adamic, descendant down a different species line. I mean, they're not even human, mud people. Is real common terminology you see in the hate movement. And so particularly with hate groups, a lot of this worldview with Jews off in these evil conspiracies is reinforced by a theological belief system. And we'll get into that a little more. The way this works in communities, the way this kind of construct hits the ground in communities is, number one, demonizing your opponents. That it's not enough to say, we just happen to disagree. The opponents generally are portrayed as inherently evil, unpatriotic, anti-Christian, you name it. It gets to be very personal attacks that demonize the opponents of whoever these folks are organizing. Secondly, the sides become very polarized. There isn't really any room for compromise, because who's going to compromise with these evil people over here? And if we do compromise, it's going to mean the end of the world. I mean, we could be talking about the color of toilet paper to put in the kids' bathrooms in the schools, and if you're dealing with an extremist group, the consequence of failing to put pink toilet paper in there is going to be the downfall of the nation. The consequences are always inflamed, and that polarizes people. It gets them agitated, it gets them angry, it makes them feel that no matter what's at the basis of the argument, that if they lose, somehow their whole world is diminished, that kind of polarization. Once that starts to happen, Montana is a great place to do this kind of work because the communities are small enough you can see all this very clearly happening. Once communities really start to polarize along those lines, the next thing that we've seen in community after community in Montana is threats. And there are generally two kinds of threats. One is what I call the normal kind of Montana threat, which is you go to the county commission meeting, they say something that has made you mad, and you're up there testifying, and you just get a little carried away and say, I'm going to blow your head off. That's kind of a normal threat. And I think, you know, we should look at that as something that is people getting carried away and tempers kind of taking the day. And we shouldn't assume that because someone loses their temper in these kind of meetings, if we're talking about water issues or something like that, that's very different than the different kind of threat that we're seeing a lot of now, and that's the midnight phone call, the anonymous letter, the threats that take time to think through, that are planned, that are plotted out and intended, and make no mistake about this, they are intended to terrorize the person on the receiving end to get them to do whatever you want them to do. We're seeing those kinds of threats all over the state now around school curriculum issues, around land use planning issues, around militia kinds of issues, but it's covering kind of a broad spectrum of different issues and different bases that people are now engaging in this kind of behavior. And we need to recognize it's pretty serious stuff if you get people coming in trying to use this anonymous form of terrorism to get their way in the political arena. And what we see happening as a result of that kind of terrorism is the debate shuts down. County commission after county commission has said, you know, this planning stuff, we knew there's a lot of growth here and we need to manage it, but you know, this public outcry and these weird phone calls I'm getting to threatening to kill my dogs and that kind of stuff, we need to slow down. We need to slow down. Let's revisit this in a year after I'm off the county commission, you know. That's happening on school boards. In Livingston, we've had school board members have the lug nuts loosened on their car scratched. I mean, it really is shocking how much of that's going on around the state, and it begins to shut down the debate. People don't want to deal with that kind of controversy, the result being that the extremists that are kind of promoting their agenda, which is often to stop whatever the positive action moving forward may be, win by default. The second thing that I think is a big concern is who's going to run for school board? Who's going to run for county commission when part of the job description is you're going to get phone calls in the middle of the night. And those phone calls are going to say, I know how your kid walks to school. People say, well, you know, the $4,000 a year isn't worth that. And if it's a school board, the nothing a year isn't worth that. People participate in our democratic institutions out of a sense of wanting to do something positive and be constructive in their communities. They don't participate because they like to get these weird threats. They don't participate because they like to be in the midst of controversy where their religion is challenged, where their patriotism is challenged. So there are really some pretty serious consequences of that. But it is a pattern that we see developing across a lot of communities in Montana. We're also seeing some kind of shifting and changing in the typical targets of extremist behavior. And the first is government employees. More than anybody right now, the targets of extremist organizations, the hate movement, even out of the religious right and the wise use movement, the big bad guys are government employees. And among government employees, it's federal employees. And among federal employees, it's law enforcement employees. And among law enforcement, federal law enforcement, it's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the FBI. Those are really kind of the biggest demons out of a lot of this movement. And as we go through the militia stuff, that'll begin to be real clear. So government employees now find themselves out there as the major target. Coming right along behind them, and we'll talk about this a little more, particularly in the Northwest and the West, coming right on the heels of that is environmentalists. This, again, is kind of a new group that, 4 or 5 years ago, if you were thinking, well, who are the real targets of extremist organizing or right-wing activity in this country, you wouldn't have thought of environmentalists. But we're seeing now all kinds of incidents of attacks on environmentalists. There's a book out now called War on the Greens, which details a lot of these assaults and threats and bombing in LA. If you get a chance, pick that book up and go through it. It's very enlightening. And you begin to understand that these folks and environmental organizations out in rural communities in particular are really hanging out there and getting a lot of grief for their activity. Right behind that is homosexuals. Now, homosexuals are probably the biggest target out of all of these groups in terms of the day-to-day facing of violence. That gay bashing is very accepted in most communities around the country. It's not challenged very strenuously by law enforcement, and so day-to-day the people who are getting the most attacks out of this is the homosexual community, and they play a major role as a stalking horse within the literature. But the recent focus that we've seen in Montana and the Northwest has been this federal law enforcement, BATF, Waco, the Randy Weaver incident, that kind of stuff. But we should all understand that the community that is day-to-day really facing violence is the gay and lesbian community. Following behind that is abortion providers. I mean, we're kind of hitting some new things here, but all of us are aware of the clinic bombings, that these are terrorist acts. It's very interesting that as we look at all of the commentary going on now around the Oklahoma City incident, there is some mention of terrorist attacks on clinics, but not much. I mean, it's obvious that most of the law enforcement community and the pundit community doesn't link up extremist organizing, extreme right-wing stuff, and clinic violence. They just aren't linking it up, and yet it's very linked up. And the people working in those areas are obviously major targets of extremist organizations. Minority people, obviously major targets, and of course the Jewish community are major targets. And then one I forgot to write down is people who speak out on human rights issues. So all of you people, with I'm sure 1 or 2 exceptions in this room, are people who are active in these causes, also are targets of these organizations. Over the last 4 or 5 years, obviously we've seen an increase in the kind of radical right-wing activity around the country and in the West in particular. We think part of that is shifting economies, that we're moving from resource extraction to service economies. That's making people uptight and nervous. I think we should all understand that people are not really rational about this, that a person can be sitting there making good money in a good job, getting regular pay increases, and still be absolutely convinced that the economic base they're sitting on is falling apart and absolutely in ruin, and they're much worse off than they used to be, particularly if they're listening to these information systems that are feeding them conspiracy theories or the kind of drumbeat of talk radio about how much worse off you are, that we need to understand people are upset about that even if it's not rational and not making a lot of sense. It's easy to convince someone they're a victim, and there are a lot of people out there trying to convince people they're victims. So that's part of it. Then the popular media piece, the Rush Limbaugh. One of the few very entertaining factors of watching all of this talk on TV right now is watching Rush Limbaugh go like this and Ollie North kind of, oh, not us, not us. I mean, finally there's being some challenge. They're handling it real well, and I think they're probably going to turn it right back around. Who couldn't turn it back around? They've got all day on radio to talk about it. Bill Clinton and the rest of us are lucky to get a 2-minute soundbite on this topic. That's a piece of this, but we also should look at those guys are one thing, Rush and G. Gordon Liddy and those folks, but what about local talk? Some of the local talk is just unbelievable. Valley Speaks up in Kalispell. I mean, I've gone on that program twice, and it's like, can you really believe what you're saying? Constantly reinforced by the host, who I think the last thing they read was Dick and Jane. I mean, no information at all. I mean, no dealing with factual material. I think the local cloning of the kind of obnoxious national radio talk show host is probably having as much effect as anything else. Then, of course, political figures look at all of this out there in the landscape and say, well, I know the way to get elected. It is to go after the government, to criticize the federal government, to talk about our institutions and how bad they are and how they aren't doing their job. I mean, when was the last time you heard someone running for office saying, geez, you know, the federal government's done a lot of good stuff, and we're really proud that they've done it, and I want to participate and be a part of it. I mean, people don't run that way. You run by being critical, and frankly, I think we all ought to recognize that if you did run that way, you probably wouldn't win. So the whole political process tends to focus a lot on the negative. The last election cycle, I think the negativity that was out there was something that kind of went up a notch from anything that Montanans had experienced for a long time, and so that plays into it. But the other thing that really, I think, begins to pull it together is the fact that we have conscious organizing efforts by people who are very skilled in community organizing and building organizations around these kind of negative themes. And those people are coming into polarized communities and try and pull people to support their cause. And this is not just kind of cynical political manipulation. We're talking about people who really believe in what they're doing, but they are capable community organizers who are organizing on very negative themes, organizing for change. Welcome to sitting on the side of the status quo. I mean, when I grew up, we wanted a lot of change. Vietnam was going on, and the environmental movement. We were organizing outside the status quo. And these folks have taken a lesson from exactly the same kinds of techniques to build grassroots support, and many of them are very capable, and many of them have targeted the Northwest for their activity. And that's what I want to talk about next. There are a couple of things that have led to what I refer to as the cultural sneer that we're in right now. I mean, every time anybody starts to talk about anything in the public arena, you can just see people kind of assume this, oh yeah, here we go, kind of attitude. That's not accidental. That has come from a lot of things, and you know, you can go back and you can talk about Watergate and the Vietnam War and this kind of loss of innocence and all of that stuff. But that's too far back for me to remember, so I'm not going to get into that. I want to make this a little more recent. And go back to the mid-'80s and talk about some of these specific social movements. The first one being the religious right. And this is where I always make at least one person mad. So let me give you a definition of the religious right. These organizations portray themselves as religious organizations. They are not. They are political organizations using a lot of religious verbiage to justify a political agenda that they want to impose using the political process. One of the primary monitoring groups of extremism in the U.S. is the Anti-Defamation League. And for a long time, the Anti-Defamation League has been pretty cautious about jumping into the religious right fray. Because many of the leadership, of one reason, is much of the leadership of the religious right is very pro-Israel, you know, complicated situations. But finally, last year, ADL put out a very good report on the religious right with a definition that I can attribute to them. So when you get mad, I can refer you to ADL and move on and talk to someone else. The religious right is an array of politically conservative religious groups and individuals who are attempting to influence public policy based on a shared cultural philosophy that is antagonistic to pluralism and church and state separation. And this is the book is called The Assault on Tolerance and Pluralism in America. That's what we're talking about with the religious right. Specific groups we're talking about are organizations like the Christian Coalition, like the Family Research Council. These groups pop up and die out and pop up and die out, but I think most people are familiar with the phenomena we're talking about, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. The religious right really hit the map politically during the Reagan elections. I mean, they were around before then, people identified them before then, but with the election of Reagan, they delivered a political constituency to a presidential candidate. And what that gave them was tremendous access to federal power, to the federal authority. And they used that. in a number of areas very effectively. One of the primary areas was a restructuring of the federal judiciary and all of the appointments that the Reagan administration made to the federal bench. There was litmus testing going on, believe me, and it was going on issues like abortion, school prayer, those kinds of things. By the mid-'80s, a couple of things had happened within the religious right that made it apparent to them that a change in strategy was appropriate. The first was that, well, first of all, we had the wonderful Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart things, which was one of the few bright moments in all of our political past during this period. So they recognized that these nationally based, direct mail supported political organizations were vulnerable to the personal peccadillos of their leadership. And a lot of people said, this isn't good because when Jimmy goes down to the South Side in New Orleans, we got a problem. So there was examination of that. But more importantly, they failed in getting abortion banned, which is major and central to this movement, and they failed in school prayer, which is major and central to this movement. They had all of this access to federal power and couldn't get those basic things. With the election in 1986, Democrats retook the U.S. Senate. Some of their major supporters got beat. Time to lick our wounds, look at strategy. And what they came up with was time to go back to the grassroots. This is, we're talking 86, 87, back in this time period. And if you go through their books and their literature, the decision is we need to take our resources and get out of this behind the beltway stuff, get out of this, entirely direct mail supported mode and move down to the grassroots. And two of the primary targets as they moved down to the grassroots were local school elections and state legislative elections. And they worked very effectively in those arenas. Here in Montana, we beat them a lot on school elections. The good news is you can win these fights with these folks. But this decision-making process going on in the mid-'80s, saying, okay, let's move to a different arena, get back to the grassroots. And they had a lot of success there. The other thing to understand about the religious right is that among their many messages, there is a very strong anti-environmental message. They are laissez-faire when it comes to business and economics. Get government out of business and let business do what business needs to do so we can get things done. Ironically, much of the justification for this, and James Watt has actually even said this, is that the second coming is right around the corner, so why worry? Jesus is coming back, why worry? We don't need to be concerned about these things. Kind of something that I think a lot of us don't think about is the underpinnings. But to give you an example of this, at the Christian Coalition state meeting here in Bozeman last year, their main speaker was talking about environmental issues. And his theme was, they're using aerosol to scare us all. This is why we're losing. They're much better speaking at these public things. But a very strong anti-environmental message, and along with that, a very strong anti-federal government message. Because who's enforcing environmental regulations? In Montana, how about water quality? State Water Quality Bureau? No, it's the federal government that's got all of this outrageous regulation that's holding people down. And that anti-federal message isn't restricted just to the environmental arena. Also look at the position on schools. What do these folks want to do with schools? They don't want federal supported schools, although some of them would like federal money, but they sure don't want any federal ideas coming along with it. And our state legislatures action sending $6 million for school improvement back to the federal government saying, we don't want your money, is something that we all ought to sit up and take a look at. And that was very clearly generated out of individuals and organizations supported by the religious right in Montana. And it made a big difference in day-to-day educational programs in our schools. That's something they did at the state level. So this anti-federal theme moves across a lot of the work of the religious right. And so it feeds into this whole kind of social condition we've got going out here, the big cultural sneer. The irony is they refer to themselves as a community of faith, and they have faith in nothing. They have no faith in our public institutions. They have no faith in our ability to do something positive in the public arena, and the primary target of that has been the federal government, and environmentalism is a big part of their agenda. So that's one aspect. Moving on now to another big social movement. This is my sociology stuff. I took classes in this in college, so I can speak about it. The next thing to come down the pike, also in the mid-'80s, well, 1988, is the wise use movement. Now, and here's a new idea. Actually, wise use movement kind of grew out of the old sagebrush rebellion, the idea that we're going to take the federal lands and give them back to the states. Something we haven't heard for a long time, right? Sagebrush rebellion kind of died out. In 1988, there was a conference in Reno, Nevada, bringing together a whole bunch of interesting people. It was put together by a guy named Ron Arnold, and I always have to write these things down because I forget otherwise. Sponsored by the Center for Defense of Free Enterprise, bringing together a whole bunch of reasonable people to talk about what these unreasonable environmentalists have done. The reasonable people, and there are about 250 people there, the reasonable people included Boise Cascade, DuPont, Exxon, Georgia Pacific, Associated Logging Contractors of Idaho, National Association of Wheat Growers, Nevada Cattlemen's Association, Nevada Miners and Prospectors Association, Western Forest Industries Association, reasonable people to talk about restructuring our environmental regulatory system, all getting together to talk about political activism. Mr. Arnold proposes to these folks, you know what we really need to do is get back to the grassroots. We need to get out of behind the Beltway, and we need to go down back into communities. We need to organize a political constituency to what? Open up federal lands, to assure that the Mining Act of 1872 isn't reformed, to get us some timber supplies. We need some timber supplies. There's a bunch of it sitting over there on the public lands. Then we got a bunch of people who are saying, and also the grazing rights. So you've got these kind of business interests coming together to talk about resources locked up behind federal lands and in studies and other kind of regulatory barriers. Out of that conference, they published the Wise Use Agenda, which had 25 points, but some of the more interesting ones were harvest of old growth forests to prevent global warming. They wanted to cut out those old trees and get young trees in there again because they eat up carbon dioxide faster, I guess. I'm not sure exactly of the science of this, but they called it the Global Warming Prevention Act that they wanted to support. Development of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They wanted caribou to get exercise by jumping over pipelines. No, I'm not. They didn't say that. They wanted to challenge the protection of non-adaptive species, like California condor. These species who are going anyway. Extinction is a fact of life. We ought to quit, locking up stuff to protect these non-adaptive species. And then the other neat thing they wanted to do was make sure that industry had standing to sue environmental groups and people in communities who cost them money by stopping their ability to develop. All of the rhetoric coming out of this conference was really very kind of, we need a reasoned approach. We're really all environmentalists. We're all green. After all, Exxon has lots of green. So we all should be able to just wrest this control away from the radical environmentalists. And the thing that's important to recognize what's really going on here is a strategic decision to say what we need to do is get back down to the local level, right next to those folks in the religious right who are down there pounding away at the school board level, pounding away at the state legislative level, and portray ourselves as grassroots. They're not, in fact, grassroots. They were able to, big money was involved in this. One of the organizations was selling board seats to individuals for $15,000 apiece. I doubt that Ralph would be on our board if we charged $15,000 to have a board seat. This was a very cynical, is a very cynical kind of corporately funded attempt to manipulate a grassroots constituency. And I think by definition, it's not in fact grassroots. They've been able to turn out a lot of people because they have a lot of money and resources, and also because they use things like giving people time off from a mill to go to a demonstration in downtown Portland. They are using employment situations to organize people. When I go to a rally, well, now that I work for the Human Rights Network, I don't take time off, I just go. But before, when I was a bureaucrat, I took time off, and you know, all of us who've organized rallies know that's a hassle. That's why we never get any people to go anywhere. Of course, they're all working. So the Wise Use Movement is, again, pushing down to the local level a lot of activity. Then something interesting started to happen in the Wise Use Movement that I think is genuinely grassroots, and that's the property rights movement. A subset of the Wise Use Movement is these folks who are very concerned, and I think reasonably so, that they've invested their life savings in something, and now through regulatory fiat, the government is going to turn it into a wetland, and I can't sell it, and I can't make any money on it, and that means something to me. And I'm afraid of that. And that aspect of the Wise Use Movement is the growth sector, the kind of corporately funded, cynical manipulation of mill workers, et cetera, et cetera. That's a big problem that still exists. But this property rights piece of this movement is really the growth sector. And in fact, that's what we're seeing in Montana growing very quickly around planning disputes in the Flathead, Ravalli County, Lewis and Clark County. This is genuinely grassroots. In other words, it is people who are not being given the day off going to these meetings because they have what they perceive to be a legitimate concern. Now, they're being fed information about things like regulatory takings that I think we all could question, you know, how much are you really at risk that the federal government is going to come and designate your land as a wetland. So I think there's some factual issues, but we need to understand that that is in fact something that I think really has a grassroots aspect to it. What we get out of these movements is the agitation, which brings in the next and final social movement I want to talk about, which is the hate movement. And now this is where we move to militias, which I'm sure you all really came to hear about. But it takes a while to get there, so bear with me. The hate movement, again, let's go back to the mid-1980s, specifically 1986. Aryan Nation, every year, Aryan Nation over in Hayden Lake, every year has the Aryan Congress, where they get together and they strategize. In '86, they came up with a new idea, and the new idea is referred to as the Northwest Imperative. What they decided was, you know, there are just too many of these other people out there, these non-white people and these Jews, that we're not going to be able to take all of America back. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide it up, and we can give Jewish people New York, and we can give black people the Southeast, and we'll give those Mexican people the Southwest, and Asians will give the West Coast, but we Aryans are going to have the northwestern states of Idaho, Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Wyoming. This is the new Aryan homeland. And beginning at about that time, we saw a lot of stuff in the literature saying, come on, join us in the Northwest. It's already white, it's rural, it's got the climate that our folk need, kind of summoning people to the Northwest. Now, how much that's really occurred is really hard to say. But what we do know is some significant organizations and individuals have kind of moved from where they used to be to here. One being America's Promise, which is a Christian identity church that used to be in Arizona, which is now Hispanic land, has moved up here. Bo Greitz has moved out of Nevada and has moved to Idaho. Louis Beam, who is a Klan organizer, a very competent individual, has been floating around in this area of the country a lot more. And we've seen these organizations becoming a lot more active in the northwestern states since 1986, but in particular over the last couple of years. So that's one change that's going on. The other change that's going on is a generational shift in the hate movement. The old hate group leaders are like Richard Butler, who, you know, wears an Aryan symbol up here and likes to light swastikas, and when you ask him, are you racist or anti-Semitic, he says, damn right and proud of it, real fast. The new generation is much more like David Duke, much more sophisticated about how to use electronic media, much more sophisticated about how to use buzzwords, much more sophisticated about taking a reading of the political landscape and coming up with mechanisms to reach out and grab people and pull them in, to take note of the fact that we're having a school board fight here about a sex ed curriculum that is really promoting homosexuality. This new generation coming up really is much better at that and much better at forming these kinds of ideas to go out and grab people from more mainstream political movements. One of the subsets that I want to focus on within the hate movement is the so-called constitutionalists or freemen, and this is where many of the militia people come in. That is, it's a specific set of beliefs. We use a general definition to define a hate group, and that is any organization that advances the idea there are inherent biological or genetic differences between groups of people and assigns a value along those lines, saying that one group is more favored by God or one group has more rights under the Constitution than another along those biological differences. As with any movement, it's got its wings or arms. The militia represents very much the military wing. Constitutionalists and freemen are kind of the political theorist wing. Christian identity, the theology that I talked about earlier, is the religious wing. And so there are different kind of aspects of this movement that have different areas of emphasis or different areas of interest. And the constitutionalists are very common. Now, this is where I'm doing multimedia tonight. I get yelled at by the staff because they say you're boring when you just talk. So please try and do some overheads. And I get confused and they stick together and all that stuff. But one of the things that we watch for when we deal with these constitutionalist groups is a concept called 14th Amendment citizenship, or they'll call themselves sovereigns, or they'll call themselves organic citizens. Tim McVeigh, there have been a couple of news reports now that he refers to himself as a sovereign. What's going on here is a belief that there are two statuses of citizenship in this country. One is an organic citizen in which you derive your citizenship rights from the Constitution and the first 10 Amendments, which is transferring those rights from God. That's a God-given document. That's a divinely inspired document. And your citizenship rights really are granted by God through the Constitution, the first 10 Amendments. And guess what? Only white people get those. And really only white men, usually. And women get them by being with white men. This is an example of that belief system. The 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, is what grants to all those others out there their citizenship. That's granted by men and can be taken away by men. This is the belief system of the freemen, the constitutionalists that you see down in Valley County that start floating around wise use issues and planning fights. Because I know that you in the back can't see this, I don't care, and I'm going to take it off. I'll read it. It was the 14th Amendment which gave the Negro a different citizenship than the white man, and legally he became a citizen of the District of Columbia by privilege. And as with any government privilege, it can be withdrawn at any time. White citizens, on the other hand, have other rights, not conferred unto them by the Constitution, but guaranteed to them by the Constitution. And then there are privileges and immunities conferred on those of colored races through the 14th Amendment. That is one of many kind of articulations of this idea of organics or sovereigns. The way this works in communities, you'll see people will sever themselves. If you're a constitutionalist, you can only be subject to the jurisdiction of the government if you allow them to take that jurisdiction. And the way you allow them to do that is by getting a license from them, getting a driver's license, registering your car, registering your game farm, or a Social Security card. And if you've done that somewhere in your past and you've become enlightened, you have to go through a process to sever that relationship. And what you do is you announce that you're becoming a severed citizen. Some of these guys go on the courthouse steps and announce. Many of them will take out legal ads in the paper saying, I, a white son of a white son of a white son of a white son of a white son, am hereby blah, 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 throw in Latin phrase here, and now I've severed myself, and I'm not going to pay any taxes, and I'm driving home on the interstate, and what do you think of that? And you see that in a lot of communities in Montana. They'll file documents in the county courthouse, and the county clerk and recorders get to deal with them. But this is something that we see throughout the white supremacist movement, and this is the political philosophy that goes along with Christian identity, that theological belief system that I talked about earlier. One of the places where there is a very clear convergence with the wise use folks out of this movement is the county rule crowd, or home rule, the county movement. Out of the wise use movement, and particularly groups like the National Federal Lands Conference, there's a promotion of the idea that the county can come in and control all of the land within the political boundaries of the county, including federal land. This is something being promoted out of the quote-unquote wise use movement. Well, lo and behold, as this hits the ground in Hamilton, Montana, all of a sudden we see constitutionalists who have always had this great idea about the county, primarily through a group called the Posse Comitatus, now grabbing Jim Catron County plan and running off to the county commission saying, this is what we need to do, and if you don't believe me, please take note of the sidearm on my hip. So we begin to see this kind of coming together, and this isn't even a conscious thing, I don't think, that they look out over here and see, oh, that fits what we believe, and grab that and then begin to use that to advance the same old ideas they've always had. The other piece of this is tax protest and Red Beckman. You may have noticed on that, on that slide, down at the bottom, Red Beckman is a guy down in Billings who lost his land in a tax fight, portrays himself as, he's kind of one of the political theorists in this movement, a very nice kind of patrician guy, but he talks about the Holocaust, and he says, they talk about the terrible Holocaust of Hitler's Nazi Germany. Was that not a judgment upon a people who believe Satan is their God? Virulent anti-Semitism. I got in an argument with a reporter about this. He said, that's not really hardcore anti-Semitism. Oh, okay, fine. But Red, generally, he doesn't talk about this stuff when he's in public meetings. He talks about tax policy and the income tax and his kind of bizarre political ideas. I see everybody is getting tired now. So it's time for our commercial break. During the commercial break, please keep in mind that the Missoula Advocates, the Rankin Peace Center, and the Human Rights Network are supported by contributions. And I'm going to start this around the room, and I'm going to watch and see if anybody takes anything. And if you'd like to donate further, I know people were giving contributions as they came in, and we appreciate that. That's great. We're going to now have a little fun because, you know, human rights is always so serious. This is a tape that we got from Militia Montana. It's an example of why these militia groups are doing better than human rights groups. And I've got the lyrics up here, although some of the lyrics are missing. I was going to do one of those bouncing ball things on a computer, but I'm not that multimedia yet. When I get that multimedia, we'll have the bouncing ball. And I'm sure some people will have a hard time hearing this, but we'll give it a shot anyway.
He tried to put his street clothes on but couldn't find his shoe. The night before he tied one on, now cobwebs filled his head. By afternoon he called in sick and then went back to bed. The next day he felt shaky but he made it off to work. yes to increase foreign aid. Although our nation's infrastructure's worn and torn and frayed, while veterans and nation sons become the unemployed, since NAFTA passed those aliens will gladly fill the void. Yippee-yi-yo, yippee-yi-yay. Vengeance is on the way. I say we hang 'em, till their toes are dangling. Stretch those traitors' necks, hang 'em high. Before they up and bust us, let's use old-fashioned justice and go out and get a rope and hang 'em high. My senator just voted yes to pass the Brady bill. He thinks if he can take my guns, it's him that won't be killed. He doesn't give a hang about the crime he helps create, as long as bribes keep coming in. Americans can wait. Yippee-yi-yo, yippee-yi-way. Vengeance is on the way. It's time we hang 'em, till their toes are dangling. Stretch those traitors' necks, hang 'em high. Before they're up and bust us, let's use old-fashioned justice. Go out and get a rope and hang 'em high. Check 'em out, size 'em up, look 'em up, find 'em out. If they're in, vote 'em out. If they're out, hunt 'em down. Drag 'em into the court, have their trade reversal. Use your vote like a rope, hang 'em high. Hang 'em high. Yeah.
I think that's all on one thing, you know, those keyboard deals. Now, I know that basket's moving around, so keep it coming up this way. That's kind of a segue into the militia stuff. And I apologize this isn't clear, but I'm still working on being multimedia. The militia movement, what we started really picking up the militia. Well, let me give you the whole story on this. One of the things that we try and do is get on mailing lists of right-wing groups. And during the Weaver siege over in Idaho, a new group formed called United Citizens for Justice. And it was formed by John Trockman. Louis Beam apparently had a hand in it. There were a couple of media reports that had him speaking at some of the formation meetings of this group. A guy named Chris Temple, who used to be up in Polson, has now moved to Kyla, I think, organized this group that was really kind of a Randy Weaver support group. And they went around organizing along the theme of federal law enforcement abuse, using Weaver as a martyr, encouraging people to join them in their efforts to deal with federal law enforcement stuff. United Citizens for Justice was around for a while. They got involved in a case out in central Montana. An old ranching couple, an older couple, got in trouble with the Fish and Wildlife Service for poisoning eagles, and they became kind of a cause celeb for United Citizens for Justice for a while. And then there was some kind of internal blow up, and I'm not sure exactly what it was, but United Citizens for Justice kind of shuffled off the map. A couple months after that, maybe even been 6-7 months, all of a sudden we got mailing Militia Montana. And Militia Montana obviously was using the same mailing list to begin to build along this theme of forming local militias to deal with very heavily promoting the Waco stuff and Randy Weaver as a martyr, but also adding in gun control as an issue that they were concerned about. Then along comes the Brady Bill, and this goes from something that we looked at as, well, this is interesting, to these guys attracting crowds of 200 people to 800 is one of the estimates we got in a meeting in Kalispell, to their community meetings. And that really made us take them pretty seriously when, you know, we'd have meetings and talk about human rights stuff to all 5 of us. And they're getting 800, and it's like, boy, this isn't good. So we began trying to figure out really what was going on there, but it's just a classic example of reaching out into the mainstream along a different line of issues to pull people in. The militia movement, you know, everybody's talking about it, well, it just sprung up, or it sprung up, you know, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. In fact, the concept of unorganized militias has been held very closely to the breast of the white supremacist movement for a very long time. William Potter Gale, one of the founders of the Posse Comitatus, when he was prosecuted in California in the mid-'80s for his activities in a group called the Committee of the States, it was a big prosecution on tax violations, criminal conspiracy stuff. One of the elements of that was the unorganized militia. Gale had been promoting those. White supremacist activists had been promoting formation of quote-unquote unorganized militias for years. What happened here was we had somebody, the Trockman family, clearly aligned with, despite their protests otherwise, clearly aligned with white supremacist organizations, kind of shaking this up, redressing it a little bit, and moving it out into the mainstream along the strong anti-government sentiments that we talked about in these other movements. And of course the white supremacist movement is revolutionary. I mean, anti-government is putting it mildly. These are revolutionary organizations that really advocate a different government coming in through some kind of means, often violent, kind of dressing up and moving into the mainstream. We began to get concerned about it for a couple of reasons. And if you look at the militia movement nationally, it is almost like, imagine a funnel moving through the body politic. And at the very front end of that, it's picking up a lot of people. And it's picking them up by talking about gun control and talking about the federal government being out of control. And then as it moves, people move farther back into it, and then they get exposed to these rather bizarre conspiracy theories, and a bunch of people drop out. A lot less support when people figure out, well, these guys really think that there are Gurkha troops sitting in the Bitterroot Mountains ready to flow out into Missoula. A lot of people kind of drop out at that point. But some stay in, and then they move a little farther into the funnel where they start kind of intersecting with, well, you know, a lot of problems here have to do with international banking and the monetary system. And then they move a little farther back in, and they're introduced to who's behind that, and the anti-Semitic stuff starts. And then out the far end, popping out of this funnel, is people like Tim McVeigh, who have kind of gone through this process of being exposed to pretty wild conspiracy theories and are getting angry and angrier and angrier and angrier and wanting to do something. And then they get frustrated with the militia guys. Well, all you guys do is meet and show videotapes. I'm sick of that. I'm ready. They get out of the quote-unquote militia movement, the kind of public face of the militia movement, and are very radicalized and ready for direct action. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened with The Order, which is a white supremacist group, murdered talk show host Alan Berg down in Denver, armored car robbery in Ukiah, California, kind of a crime spree across the country. Those guys got sick of the meetings and got tired of the talk and wanted to go out and do it. And when they made that decision, they gravitated away from the leadership of the white supremacist movement and gravitated away from the kind of public face of these organizations and became really the criminal underground. One of the things that happened at that time, after the order prosecution, there was a shift in the tactics in the literature of white supremacist organization. The leadership recognized that through the prosecution of the order, a whole bunch of stuff came out about the white supremacist movement, who'd been doing what. This combined with another trial, 14 of the leaders in the white supremacist movement were tried for sedition in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and the government didn't make the case. They were all acquitted, but the leadership still got the message that to the extent we get associated with the criminal activities of the members of our groups, we're going to have trouble. And so following that, there began to emerge a new concept in the white supremacist movement, which was very small cells. Louis Beam authored a paper in 1992 at a meeting held down in LaPorte, Colorado, called Leaderless Resistance. And his concept, and remember, Louis Beam is retired military and very competent and capable. And the concept is you organize in very small groups of up to maybe 7 people, and then you don't talk to anyone else, that you don't have any interrelationships with other organizations or other groups of people for purposes of planning your activity. Just go out there and do it. And the kind of political education that the movement gives you ought to tell you what the proper targets are going to be and where we ought to be concentrating our action. So this is the only thing I think that is going to be, it's not the only thing that's going to be interesting about what happens with the prosecution in Oklahoma City, but one of the things that we are predicting is that there aren't going to be a whole lot of people involved in this. If they ever get to everybody who was involved, I mean, you're hearing some of the commentators now, speculation that the whole damn racist movement knew this was going on. The whole radical right wing knew this was going on. And I'll be very surprised if that's what happens. I think it's going to be one of these small, very independently operating, kind of mad people who've come through the radical right and popped out here in terrorist land. So I've got some more overheads here about the militia movement that we can go through. Probably the most active militia group in the country is Militia Montana. But we talked about these other social movements, and we're seeing the militia try to play into the religious right and trying to play into the wise use movement and grab people through their frustration that's being reinforced in these other movements. And that's something that, I think all of us understand real easily. But the more interesting thing is we're now seeing religious right, quote-unquote, organizations and leaders calling for formation of militias. This is from Frontlines Research, which is by Planned Parenthood. Done by Planned Parenthood, excellent publication. Missionaries Leaders Calls for Armed Militia. This is growing up out of the abortion dispute. This is right-to-life activists, missionaries to the preborn. This guy, his quote is, my son Jeremiah, I'm teaching him to be a freeman. I grab his trigger finger and he's 16 months old, and if you ask him, Jeremiah, where's your trigger finger? He'll go like this immediately. Now, this is someone that we don't associate with the white supremacist movement. We don't associate them with, groups like the Aryan Nation, but this is a call for militia organizing, militia tactics, this frustration with the federal government. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? We're going to grab guns. We're going to go after it. And so we're starting to see those things come out of that movement. In addition, I'm never going to figure these things out again, but that's all right. This is a publication called the Federal Lands Update. This is a wise use group. Karen Budd is involved in this. These are folks promoting the Catron County Plan. She worked in James Watt's Interior Department. And now we've got, why is there a need for the militia in America? Federal government's just gone over the edge. It's time, folks. We need to grab the guns. So this is coming out of the wise use movement now. Now, how successful they're being here is another question. But certainly the leadership and the mouthpieces, when you see these kinds of things in newsletters, you need to pay some attention to that. And if nothing else, even if they don't form their own militia, they're legitimizing the militia activities of other kinds of groups and encouraging their supporters to get involved in those kinds of organizations. So those things are going on, but the most active far and away is Militia Montana. And Militia Montana goes right back to the hardcore hate movement. This is an example of one of their earlier catalogs and the materials that they offer. America in Peril by Mark Kornke, who has been really sitting on the hot seat in this Oklahoma stuff. He came through Montana last, I think it was December, and then he did, at that time he talked in 3 cities, 3 towns. I'm learning in the last couple of weeks our definition of a city and other people's definition seems to be different. These things are all feeding very conspiratorial worldview stuff that's out there. The militia groups are doing 2 things in presenting themselves to the public. First is they're saying, you know, all we are is to be around when the National Guard is called out. If the National Guard is called out and has to go to Saudi Arabia or something like that, and we have a flood, then the militia will come in and we'll shovel the mud with our Mini 14s. You can get a lot of mud on the end of a bayonet. The other thing they're doing is saying, well, okay, if you don't buy that, yeah, we do talk a lot about weapons and conspiracies, and we do urge everybody to have all of the weapons that they need, but we're entirely defensive. We will only attack if attacked by the government or by whoever. And so nobody need fear us. And, you know, that's, when you look at this stuff, it is all talking about the government's coming to get you, get ready. But also, when Mark Kornke spoke in Knoxon, he did a full-day workshop. He talked about things like sniping techniques. Well, now we're kind of, well, okay, sniping, is that defensive? Is that offensive? It's offensive, but, you know, where is this line? And then, you know, the thing comes to my mind, which is, what's the best defense? It's a good offense. So it gets really clouded up. The other thing that's interesting to note in this catalog, the themes in here, we've got Waco, the Big Lie, Equipping for the New World Order, the Ruby Creek Massacre, which is a reference to Weaver, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobaccos, and Firearms story. I can't get it much better than that. Oh, yeah. Yes, I can. But this tape number 108 is an interesting one. Who Controls the Children? This is a tape that's produced by the Pennsylvania Parents Commission, which is a religious right group dedicated to fighting outcomes-based education. Nothing to do with the white supremacist movement, nothing to do with militias. It's a woman sitting there talking about outcomes-based education and where educational reform efforts are going. But here it is in Militia Montana. You know, they're selling this, and then they get back to their real themes like Waco and those kinds of things. So there's that kind of cross-germination between these organizations. This is a news release that they put out for Mark Kornke when he came through Militia Montana. He does a 3-hour intelligence update. Just goes through, names the states that have already banned handguns. This is Mark telling us. Detailed explanation of the cities that have been cordoned off city blocks in massive gun roundups. This guy also, with a straight face on videotape, talks about how the government is training the Bloods and the Crips, these youth gangs, to go door to door to take people's firearms away. He talks about there's a part of this where they talk about how documents the plan by our government to abolish the U.S. and make 4 separate countries out of the North American continent. Remember the movie America. They prove this by referring us to the back of Kix boxes. Now, if you look on the back of Kix boxes, you will see a map of the country cordoned off. I mean, seriously, they believe this stuff. It's bizarre that people buy it, but believe me, a lot of people are buying it. The militia movement they have been really having kind of a heyday in their organizing efforts up until last week. And our opinion is that what happened last week is really going to take the wind out of the sails of this social movement. I want to put up some of the kind of verbiage that we get out of these folks. Words that make you go, you can watch your letters to the editor, you can read through literature, and if you're seeing these things very often, you've probably got something going on in the community. In Missoula, I know you see these things often. In Ravalli County, I know you see these things often. The New World Order stuff, George Bush was into that one, right? He kind of coined the phrase. But these are examples of the kind of language and verbiage that they use in building these big conspiracy theories. Hopefully, things like black helicopters are going to disappear. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Administration Agency. And they're very concerned about FEMA because they think they're going to get police powers if there's a national emergency. And who knows, they may. I don't know exactly how that works. Waco obviously is a huge deal. Janet Reno, I mean, the stuff they say about Janet Reno is just amazing and only topped by what they say about Hillary Clinton. Martial law. The next song on this tape is Watch Out for Martial Law. Which is also kind of a reggae beat to that one. Got to bring Haiti up, you know. So this is the kind of verbiage that we see out of this movement. And again, I mean, we've not been talking a lot about in public meetings about Oklahoma City because we just haven't had many public meetings. But what I've already mentioned that our opinion is that there's probably going to be some small cell. To the extent it's right-wingers at all, I mean, we all need to kind of step back and remember that a lot of information is yet to come out. And it may turn out that the Norwegians paid this guy to do this because they were mad about the service in the cafeteria. So, you know, I think everybody needs to kind of keep that in mind, but there sure are some strong indicators that this was domestic right-wing terrorism. I think regardless of what happens in the prosecution of the people who are caught in the Oklahoma City thing, that the public perception of what a militia is has now aligned itself much better with what a militia really is. Most of us have this kind of warm, fuzzy feeling about militias, and we think of Minutemen and not the missiles, the Patriots way back when. You know, that our whole kind of upbringing had positive feelings about this term. They played to that. I don't think that's what people think of now when they hear militia. John Trockman and Bob Fletcher and all these guys on TV, at the extent that they're on TV now, I think are revealing themselves pretty clearly for what's really going on here. And I'll be surprised if they held a community meeting in Kalispell right now, they might get 800 people singing "Hang 'em, hang 'em, hang 'em." But they aren't going to get 800 people coming that are feeling warm, fuzzy, and supportive of the militia movement, which is a good thing. But we need to remember that there are a lot of people in that funnel who believe that this was a government plot, that the government did Oklahoma City for an excuse to go after the militias. And there are people in there who believe that, and there are still people who will be and have been popping out the other end of that funnel. So it's not like this issue's gone away. That we'll still be dealing with the people involved in it. And the other thing to remember is organizers like the Trockmans and the people involved in the hate movement are very adept at reconstituting themselves. And we have some controversies still to come in our society about poverty and welfare and homosexuality and all of these hot button issues that these guys understand very well how to go out and get people in. So while the militia movement may kind of die out, these folks are in the business of figuring out where to go to develop support in another area. And I'm sure that 5 years from now, we'll all be looking back and saying, boy, this sure seems a lot like that old militia stuff. So why don't we do questions, comments, jokes, anything like that? We went too long. Yeah.
Well, I have kind of some comments, and I also have a kind of question at the end of it.
Okay.
A year ago, you came down to the bid room and spoke to the League of Women Voters, and then you had a meeting afterwards. And from that, some of us formed our own local human rights network. And we heard pretty much the same information as what you're saying here, and we laughed at the same things that these people have been laughing at. I'll tell you, we're not laughing anymore. You know, it's getting to be really serious. I really had to contemplate whether to come to this meeting or not, because, you know, I worry about there being violence even at this meeting. Smut Warren's wife has just got out of intensive care for having a heart attack because of all these threats that have been going on. Our undersheriff is retired. You know, our sheriff says he agrees with what you people are saying. The courthouse is evacuated, like rightfully, because of bomb threats. With my understanding, Christine Kaufman wouldn't come down and speak in the bid room because she said it was too dangerous down there. I mean, and yet you say they don't draw 800 anymore, but it isn't 800. It's a dozen, a half dozen people. And how do you counteract that faceless sort of violence?
Right.
Because good people are getting out of government.
This is, you're raising an issue that is always and always has been a challenge in the work that we do. That when we talk to somebody about, you know, why don't you write a letter to the editor? A very common response we get is, well, you know, I agree with everything you say, but I don't want to write a letter to the editor because I'm going to get a call in the middle of the night. And unfortunately, that happens. When we came down to the Bitterroot a year ago, we didn't anticipate Calvin Greenup. I mean, that whole, what's going on in the Bitterroot right now is absolutely shocking. And really, people in Montana need to be standing up, and it's difficult. And the human rights group down in the Bitterroot has done a very commendable job in organizing community people to get together and say, look, we don't agree with this. The fact of the matter is, these people succeed by threatening and intimidating. And unfortunately, if you look at the history of civil rights organizing, or if you look at the history of labor organizing, political assassination is a part of it, violence and intimidation is a part of it, and the things we can do to intercede in that are fairly slim. One is to make sure we're supporting each other, to make sure that when we get the threat, people know we got the threat, people call people and say, is everything okay? I mean, when we do a community meeting, generally there's a phone in. You know, what time are you going to speak? Where are you going to speak? Call us when you're out. Call us when you're out of town and get to a phone. So you have to do those kinds of things. But the fear and intimidation is absolutely central to how these groups operate. They consciously use those tactics. The other thing that we have to be smart about and concerned about is when things are getting very hot. The decision not to go to Hamilton on the part of the network staff was based on the Calvin Greenup thing was just starting up a curve, we felt. We made the same decision in going to Cascade. And because I don't know if you all remember, but the mayor in Cascade got arrested for passing bad money orders. And what we said in Cascade is we want to wait a few weeks to see how this goes and then come. There's a real fine balancing act that's always going to be using judgment, and there are going to be differing opinions on what the judgment is between when you go, when you don't. And we had the same kind of discussion about going out on the road a lot right now in Oklahoma City, not because of fear of violence, but because of the perception that we're trying to quote-unquote capitalize on a tragedy. So there's a lot of that kind of thinking that goes into deciding where to go and when to go. But one of the things that I think is the most frustrating and the most angering to me is driving to a meeting like this and wondering what's going to happen. And I came in this room when it was empty, and I walked around and looked to see if there were boxes sitting up back here. You look at where the doors are. That's something that I resent. In a free democratic society, you shouldn't have to do that to get up and express your opinion about the activity of groups that you are politically opposed to. The reality is that you do it. Everybody should know it's a little paranoid for me to go look around. But we have had confrontations in meetings. Police have been called to our meetings. We've had confrontations at the door. We've had people sitting in meetings with firearms. And you make these calls. You know, the guy with the gun in the back of the room, do you go back there and do you say, you know, we don't want you and your gun sitting in the back of the room? Or do you say, well, let him sit there. He's just trying to make a point, and he probably isn't going to do anything here. When you have 15 to 20 of these folks crash basically a house meeting or an organizing meeting in a church basement, you make a judgment. Do you tell the police, get them out of here, they weren't invited? Or do you say, let them stay and I'll do this? You know, a public presentation, we won't get to talk about organizing, which is what happened to us up in Whitefish. It isn't easy work, and you have to dedicate yourselves to it, but the more people we get into it, and the more people who are around supporting it, and the more people who are speaking out in opposition to these folks, the less they do that. When we started this, we used to get a lot of stuff from Klan types, you know, tickets back to Africa, you know, a Klan poster with a beware you're next, that kind of stuff. We don't get so much of that anymore because they know it doesn't work. I mean, their goal is to get you to silence yourself. I think the ones who have the hardest time with this are government officials, because there really isn't, you know, they don't sit and say we got to support each other. You know, you don't see the clerk and recorder and the sheriff saying, you know, we don't support each other, which leads to the next point, which is law enforcement response is a political environment. That what the Attorney General does, what the governor does, what the local sheriff does is a political issue. That if in many communities, if Earth First was in that community, they would be on it in a heartbeat. But if it's constitutionalist, they might not be. Or you may get the Attorney General saying, well, you know, these militia groups and these human rights groups need to calm down. There are political accountability mechanisms here. And that is speaking out, and we don't need to be shrill and highly critical of people, but we need to say and create a political environment that if someone breaks the law, if someone faces down the local constable with guns, we may not pick them up right then because we know that it's too dangerous, but when we do pick them up, there's going to be hell to pay in the legal arena through prosecution. In the last legislative session, we worked for a bill to enhance the penalties for threatening public officials, to give prosecutors a real good tool to go after this stuff. And I'll bet that we see prosecutions with that new statute within 6 months. But they are tough issues. Yeah?
I was struck as you were talking about one comment you made about how isolation works to fragment communities. And I guess in myself thinking of what our responses would be, I'm drawn to the idea of reaching out to these people who are isolated and trying to find a common thread, an idea that we can share, address the concerns that really are concerns that they have in a way that brings them back into our community. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on
Yeah.
how you do that.
Well, this is something I wrestle with. My first rule is violence is not negotiable. That if what you're going to do in our discourse is threaten me physically, we're not going to talk. And unfortunately, with a lot of these groups, that's right where we get to. So, for example, we don't make any kind of effort at all to reach out and have a discussion with the Aryan Nation because violence and the things that they say are not things that we feel like we can negotiate about. But on the other hand, the religious right is a different matter. That these are people we ought to be able to sit down and talk with. And we've tried a couple of times, and it hasn't worked real well, but we take a different view. So I think the first question you have to ask is it something that we really can reach a common ground on? And are there things that we simply are not going to sit around and discuss? Many people that do this on the national level liken the hate movement to a destructive cult, in that when people are in it and so isolated, there really is only one path out, and that path out is generally a strong, personal, usually romantic relationship with someone outside that system. that immediately gives them the support. Otherwise, it's just really, really difficult to get them out. And so I think what you have to do is confront it before they get isolated and make it more difficult to let people get isolated. So in other words, prevention, getting out and saying, look, it's crazy to say that the government's got black helicopters coming after us all, and really confronting that to prevent people from dropping into the front end of that funnel. Because once they're in, I think you got to ask yourself very carefully, what's negotiable here? And if you're going to sit in the room and say, well, I want to negotiate about whether black people are human, I mean, you may want to do that, but I'm not going to do that. So we all have to make personal choices on that. Yeah?
In a way, I think what a little discussion here tonight is, I think it's bad in as much as what you're telling these folks in this room is a form of hate in itself. You put up a barrier with your talk tonight to turn these folks from listening to any other point of views. I think that is the danger, kind of along the lines of what this gal is saying, is that we can't put up barriers. A lot of what is out there is not unfounded. There is concerns about government in this country, grave concerns about government in this country. And for one point, folks, how can you look at their battle cry is Waco, their battle cry is Ruby Ridge in Idaho. How can you not stop for a minute and say, Bill Clinton should have stopped the other night and said, hey, there is a problem here. We screwed up. What we did in Waco was wrong.
Right. Let me address that because, right. Oh, right. Well, let me address that. My disagreement and our group's disagreement with these organizations is not that Waco was well handled. Okay? You never hear organizations like ours rushing to the defense of the FBI saying, way to go at Waco, or way to go at Ruby Ridge. The disagreement here is, what is the response to that? The militia movement says the response is, we're all going to grab Mini 14s, get up in the hills, and wait for these guys to come and get us. What we're saying is, no, I don't think that's a response. That's something that the disagreement isn't over the problem. We will agree readily that there are legitimate issues of federal law enforcement behavior, legitimate issues about federal policy in a host of arenas. What we object to is saying that the solution to that is violent confrontation. We don't believe that. We do our business at the ballot box. We don't need a cartridge box to enforce our political will. So we agree on those points.
That's true. But the violence in this case was begotten by the federal government. That
Right.
violence in Waco,
And nobody,
it wasn't properly
right.
addressed in the court.
But what you're doing here is shifting the focus, okay? And you and I can talk about this after the meeting because we got to get to some other stuff. But I want to emphasize, we don't think that Waco was well handled. There were real problems at Waco, Weaver's place on Ruby Ridge, horrendous problems with the FBI, monitoring of all kinds of groups. Those things we need to address, but we don't need to address them with weapons. Now, if you and I can talk when the meeting is over, we can get into this a little deeper, but I want to move to some other questions. No, please sit down now.
I was thinking of hearing Bo Greitz mention Oklahoma City as a Rembrandt earlier this week, and then President Clinton speaking out about us speaking up against hatred. And then mainstream Republican leaders, it seemed to me primarily, speaking up against President Clinton saying that we should speak out. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, the Greitz comment is shocking. I'm not sure the context. I didn't even see the tape. I understand it was on one of the major news things. But if it is as it was conveyed to me, it's shocking to call that a Rembrandt of art and science. Clinton, it's very interesting to watch now as Clinton speaks out about this malaise, to use Jimmy Carter's death knell, this malaise in the country and this negative attitude that seems to be being generated out of a whole lot of different sectors, that whole debate very quickly got turned around to Bill Clinton is now advocating censorship. I didn't hear that, and I heard that speech, and I didn't hear him. What I heard him saying was that if you are in a position with that kind of power and authority as a spokesperson, a media person, that you have, going along with that, a responsibility to behave in a way that doesn't incite what he referred to as fragile personalities. That's not saying we want to censor you. That's saying censor yourselves. What is entertaining to me is first the talk show host kind of went like this, and then the Republicans ran to their defense. And they ran to their defense because these radio talk programs are a tremendous power base for the conservative elements in the Republican Party, and they know it. And the last thing they want to see is reintroduction of the fairness doctrine. There's a big fight going on in Congress now, or it kind of died. Now I don't know exactly where it is, but it used to be in exchange for the public allowing you to use the airwaves as a radio station, you had to agree to present opposing opinions. Ronald Reagan got rid of that. I don't think Rush Limbaugh and all of this talk could exist in the environment of the fairness doctrine, where the requirement on a radio station is if you are going to present one side of this public debate, you need to provide access to the other side to present the opposing opinion. Now that, I suppose, is censorship, although I think it's not censorship because what you're requiring is other people to get on, not some people to stay off. But that's what I think is sitting underneath a lot of the kind of vehement response that we saw very quickly out of the Republican Party. Yeah, over here.
Do you have any thoughts on supporting the government in combating terrorism without opening the door to the FBI and the Border Patrol and everyone else doing the same nasty things they did to the anti-war movement,
Right.
the civil rights movement,
Right.
and the Central America Solidarity movement?
Right. I think there are a couple things that need to happen. Unfortunately, in our society, I think very quickly we run off to the legislative arena and say we need a new law. We need to ask ourselves, what really is the problem here? Is the problem that law enforcement lacks the tools, or is the problem that as a management decision, law enforcement decided not to pay much attention to the radical right? And I don't think we can answer the question about do we need different laws until we answer the question about do they have all the tools they already need and they've just made a management decision to be looking somewhere else. And I don't think we should rush into that, to the new legislation. I'm not sure at all that they don't have the tools. I am absolutely convinced that the mentality of many law enforcement agencies has had them very focused in other directions. Earth first, environmental terrorism. I mean, one of the things when we started dealing with law enforcement on this whole issue of paramilitary training and militias, all of them knew, they didn't know a lot about the Aryan Nation and stuff, but all of them knew about a group called the Environmental Rangers. They seem to know about this. As far as I know, this is one person. You know, but they all knew about that. So I think we have to ask, is this the problem here a management issue, that they have all the tools they need? And I think we want to be real careful about expanding police powers before we really have identified the problem. So, back here.
And you talked a lot about the problems tonight, and I haven't, other than writing a letter to the editor, I haven't heard what we can do to combat this at the grassroots level.
Right. Well, one thing you can do is get involved with Missoula Advocates for Social Justice and with the Human Rights Network and any other kind of organization and dedicate yourself to speaking out. I mean, what's happened, in my perspective, is we really have lost that ability to do things like the House meeting. Where are folk singers? You know, it's like all of this stuff, we don't have it anymore. And to me, it's an attitudinal shift that we have to say, when you see the wacky letter to the editor, don't roll your eyes. I mean, write a response and say, you know, I'm real tired of this. I don't agree with it. I think it's wrong, all that stuff. Call talk radio. I mean, a lot of this, I think there's a stage of confronting that we have to do and kind of debunking the myths, because unfortunately in our political system, I think the more something is repeated, the more true it becomes. And that these organizations have created a lot of truth through repetition in the face of no confrontation of what's being said. And so that's one thing that we can do. The other, you know, talk radio is the other place really to get on and confront this stuff. The other thing, and this goes to the progressive movement as a whole, and this is my kind of global political speech. This is not campaigning. The traditional Democratic coalition is dead. The Republican Party has driven a stake into the heart of the Democratic working class white support, particularly in the South. That's because we have lost sight of an coherent economic message. What's been going on in this country for a long time is wealth has been moving out of the middle class into the upper class, and we're getting a bigger, lower, poor class, okay? We really need to sit down and think about, as a quote-unquote progressive movement, how do we reach out to the people, like I was talking about, that bought the 20 acres, who now are worried they're going to lose everything, and they call up the Natural Resources Defense Fund and say, now what's the deal on this regulatory takings thing? They get sent something like this from an attorney blowing out the Fifth Amendment arguments, or they get, oh, don't take that seriously, that's just a right-wing ploy. I mean, we really need to kind of listen to that, but more importantly, we need to build a coherent message, particularly on economic issues. To the extent the Democratic Party keeps on trying to appear Republican and just position themselves immediately to the left, to the most moderate Republican, it isn't going to work. It's not going to work anymore, and it's time to rethink it. So we've got back here, someone's...
I just want to clarify something on both rights. He gave an explanation to Brian Gemmell for the Today Show.
Oh, did he?
The other day. And what he said, and I'm not a fan of it,
Right.
It was taken out of context. What he meant to say was that the Rembrandt quality of that explosion from a demolitions point of view was that it was very proficiently and expertly done, beyond the ability of few people to do, or this McVeigh to do.
Right.
And it was very expertly done and very focused on that building.
So that's...
It wasn't just a random explosion.
Right.
It did a lot of flat damage.
Yeah.
It did some, I mean,
Yeah.
very expertly done thing is what he said.
Yeah. Bo is an expert at pulling his foot out of his mouth. I don't know how many of you saw the Day One program with Bo Greitz, where he's talking with this reporter, and this reporter says, now, when you were at Ruby Ridge, it was reported that you gave a Nazi salute to some skinheads in the back of the audience. And Bo said, oh, that's not true, and I wish I had photographs of this or whatever, and in that response, and the reporter said, well, we just happen to have the videotape right here, and there's Bo, you know, this to the skinheads. Bo's response, finally, stuck for words, threatens the reporter. So Bo is very good at kind of putting his foot in his mouth and then saying, well, you know, that's not what I said, that's not what I meant. You know, I don't doubt, that sounds very plausible to me. I mean, here's an ex-military guy, understands demolition, understands tactics, et cetera, and he's got this kind of macho demeanor to him. That's plausible to me, but I've also watched Bo do that on a whole host of issues. You know, he ran for president on the Populist Party ticket as David Duke's running mate for a short period of time, and he did resign from that, but his explanation of why he got hooked up with David Duke in the first place was he didn't know who the presidential nominee for the Populist Party was going to be. Maybe that's true. So maybe he's not a racist, he's an idiot. It's kind of, he's constantly reconfiguring himself, and he's good at it. So other questions over here.
Could you say a little bit more about the people who come out of the funnel? Do they see themselves as separated from the militia, or do they see themselves as doing the dirty work?
Very often they see themselves as absolutely separated, and they're mad. They're mad that these guys, they're all talk, and we're sick of it, and they're as bad as everyone else. So, you know, Bob Matthews' stuff was that way. He, on the way down, when the talk show host was murdered, he stopped in LaPorte, Colorado, at Pete Peters' compound, and Pete Peters is a Christian identity minister, and I've got an overhead on Pete Peters somewhere in this pile. Anyway, they talked with Peters for a while and moved on because Pete Peters wasn't radical enough for him, wasn't hard enough on the issues, and all he did was sit around and talk about things, and this is Pete Peters. You know, I mean, death to homosexuals. It's not enough that you just call for it. We want to do it. So I think a lot of them, when they come out the end, are mad that they've kind of been led along, and they believe all these things, and they can't get anybody else to go with them. So, yeah.
When people are talking about what your average person can do, it just strikes me that it's so easy for people to complain about government. I worked for Congress for a couple of years. I just got back from D.C., so it's close to home. I mean, at the very basic, people can register to vote and get 500 friends to register to vote. I think so many of us hang out with the same kind of people who believe the same things we do, but I bet you'll find 4 of those people don't vote. And I'm not saying you have to donate to campaigns if you're not interested, but I mean, the least you can do is vote and have others vote. And also, maybe talk positively about what government can do. Don't forget who paves the roads that we drive on, and the fact that many of us who are complaining about the schools did pretty well to get through those schools that the government paid for. And all these programs that these people are complaining about, and if they're heavy-duty pro-life, well then how are we going to pay for those kids that are born? And we need just as much as we can complain about government too. I mean, I know they're not perfect, but at the same token, just as much time as we put into saying, I agree with you, I know Waco was bad, we need to spend just as much time saying, hey, but look at all the great things that go on. I mean, none of us have a bump sugar that says I hire government.
Well, but the folks in Hamilton have done exactly that. The full-page display ad saying we support our local government officials, Great Falls quarter page. That's a real good point. But I want to challenge people to go a little beyond registering to vote, and challenge you all to think about running, because registering to vote is a very passive activity. And if you look at this last legislature, we had bills endorsing militias, we had bills to register homosexuals. I mean, it was bad up there. Pete Peters' literature was being distributed. A Spiritual Hero, is a publication he did, was being put on the desks of the most conservative legislators by a woman from Bozeman as an acknowledgement of their great work for conservative causes. We need to really, if you're mad about this stuff, run. We need to get people running, and you sit in these not on company time because we're a nonprofit organization, but on my own time, you sit in these recruiting meetings with great people who would be great in public service. All of you sitting there scratching your head about, well, who could we get to run? Quit looking outside the room. I mean, it's really time. The other phenomena here is I'm way too radical to get elected in Montana. Hey, Montana has a very long progressive tradition. This is a state that really had some progressive roots. We need to sprinkle a little water on that and get out there and run. And even if you lose, if you're out talking about gay rights in a local legislative race, even if you lose, it's shifting the political landscape. And so we need to dedicate to that. Get out there and run. Don't call me, though, because I'm too busy to go door to door. Yeah.
I'm really glad we're on this topic. I just got back from Helena in the legislature, and I work for there are 18 representatives and senators from Missoula County, and 16 of those are Democrats. And a few of them are here tonight. I think they've left. But I think one thing that's really important that we need to remember that we can do is thank them if you see them in the grocery store or on the street, because they work their asses.
In the face of lots of fun. Yeah.
Under the prevention side, people need to be aware of what is already available in
going on in the state. Montana Association of Churches is already doing revitalization in rural areas, and they go into small communities. They work with the local county extension agents, local pastors, and get community groups going to try to resolve the problems where farmers are frustrated with lower prices, with losing their farms, with what's happening in rural areas. And this is already available, and make it known to people that it is available. And it's a wonderful program that they go in and do follow-ups, and they do surveys, and then they go in. They also put an ending point. When do you think you will have achieved these goals? Which is a wonderful change from some things that go on and on and on. Also under Montana Association of Churches, they're doing the Christian Witness for Humanity. It's being funded by one of the Liz Claiborne Foundation's foundation funding things, and they're going out and doing things related, similar to the topic that you're doing tonight, extremism and hate groups, and can do some really good informative things, anything from a half hour to a 2-hour presentation for a small group, a large group, Sunday schools, church groups, civic groups, and
The great thing about Christian Witness for Humanity, the woman doing that is Susan DeCamp, and it's very focused on Christian identity and the use of Scripture and misuse of Scripture. One of the things that I'm not very good at doing is talking about the way they're using and misusing Scripture and getting specific and countering that with Scripture. And that's a lot of what that Witness for Humanity program is about. Strongly urge people to take advantage of that, because what I gave you of Christian identity is a very kind of glossed over explanation. It is really a vicious theology, but it has real appeal to a lot of people, because the people who study the Bible and throw out the biblical quotes and things have some credibility through doing that. And part of what that project does is just take that and deconstruct completely Christian identity theology. Yeah?
You showed an overhead of one of the anti-environmental wise use group with an article on their front page talking about the militia movement and talking about the interrelationships among some of those right-wing groups. Can you talk a little bit about rebuilding progressive coalitions as something else that people can do, and active as members of all the various groups on a myriad of different issues to which we all belong, getting involved in each other's issues, church groups speaking out in favor of environmental safeguards and so forth?
Absolutely. This is the biggest place we fall down, and there are two things that have happened. The progressive movement progressed itself right inside the Beltway, and tremendous amounts of resources are going into activities at the policy level, which is very important, but we've gotten away from the grassroots, and so there needs to be a rededication to local activism. At the same time, the other important piece of that is political education across issue areas, because that's going on the right. I mean, they are doing political education across a range of issues. That's why the Christian Coalition is not an abortion group, it's a pro-family group. That allows them to go from health care to taxation to the Brady Bill to all kinds of issues. We need to get a lot better at doing that, and a big piece of it is, quote-unquote, political education. We need to have labor groups conducting education sessions for environmentalists. Environmentalists need to understand economic justice is a big deal. And until we start to link all of this up and create a coherent message, we're not going to have the coalition that will have the political power to do anything. But that's why I mentioned earlier that the New Deal coalition for the Democratic Party is dead, and we have to reconfigure it. And we have to figure out things, and a big piece of that is the economic message. Part of it is churches working together. If you look at what's going on numerically with mainline Protestant religions versus the kind of religious right fundamentalist memberships, they're really moving up, they're really moving down. There needs to be a lot of discussion about that. The mechanisms to do it, I think, are real difficult. It requires working in coalition. I think you've got a lot of people still in leadership in labor organizations and environmental organizations. and all kinds of progressive groups who are not predisposed to building broad-based kinds of support.